Well, welcome to the Prospective Drivers Call. My name is Casey Greer, and I'm joined by four amazing panelists today, and I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll go through. I have questions for everyone here. I'm going to be the moderator tonight, asking everyone on our panel these questions about low vision driving. And then at the end, we will be taking questions from all of you. So hang tight. If you want to write a question in the chat, feel free. And we will also just be taking questions too at the end if you don't want to use the chat. So let's get started. Today, joined by Chuck Huss, Brandi Green, Laughlin, and Matt Bailey. And three of the four are PWA drivers, and one of them is a professional in that field, so which is Chuck. So we're gonna take a moment. We will take a moment first to let everyone introduce themselves and kind of their relation to low vision driving. So I'll call on you randomly and we'll kind of switch up the order as we go. So first for the PWA, or no, that's just the introduction first. So Matt, go ahead.
Okay. I'm Matt Bailey. I've been a licensed driver using Bioptics since 1996. And my story was, even as a little kid, I was really into cars. Like, I always thought that like driving and voting would be the two coolest things that adults do. And it's true, actually. But I had an eye doctor who was a pretty renowned eye doctor at a pretty renowned university tell me when I was 14, well, you'll never drive. And I made a commitment to myself in the back of my mind that I will drive even if I have to invent the dadgum low vision aid myself. Unfortunately for me, it had already been invented. I just had to wait for the laws of the states to change. Unfortunately, a lot of states did just that in the 1990s, including my home state of Georgia. So I got my license in 96 and have been driving ever since. I now have a license here in North Carolina, where I live with my wife, who also has albinism and also uses a bioptic to drive. And in our case, we actually long distance dated from Georgia to North Carolina. So like our marriage and our family literally wouldn't exist if we hadn't been able to drive back and forth on I-85 to see each other back all those years ago. So
Great. Chuck, what about you? Introduce yourself.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chuck Huss. I'm a former 1976 Western Michigan O&M grad. I've been in the field for 47 years now. I just completed 39 years at the West Virginia Division of Rehab Services in the center of our state, in the state of West Virginia. I am now gainfully retired for the past 2 years. My relation to low vision driving actually began more than 4 decades ago when I was doing my internship at the Michigan Rehab Center. I had the opportunity one day to observe in the clinic, and I noticed the benefits that one of the patients derived from the use of telescopic magnification, going from 2200 without the telescope all the way down to 2040. And the clinician shared with me at that time, wouldn't this be great, Chuck, if she was a candidate for driving in this state? And she ended up being that. Fast forward a few years to my employment then with the Cincinnati William A. Proctor Center, part of the Clover Coleman School for the Blind. I shared my fascination with this experience with my supervisor, Bill Fluharty, and he in turn assigned me to a TBI who had just received a bioptic and needed to learn how to use her bioptic in using public transportation in the greater Cincinnati area. Fast forward things 8 years when I took a job here in West Virginia, and shortly after I joined forces, I accepted an invitation to join a group of professionals which were organized to screen, to train, assess, and test mild to moderate levels of persons with mild to moderate levels of central vision loss who wanted to explore driving. And the rest is history, and that's where it's ended up.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. And Brandi.
Hey everybody, I'm Brandi Green. I'm in Chicago. I am a bioptic driver. I'm a social worker, and I've been driving on and off since 2013. I can get into more of the story why I say on and off in a little bit, but I I am a restricted driver for daytime only, and of course a bioptic driver in the state of Illinois. So I'm excited to be here and offer any guidance or answer any questions. And thank you.
Thanks, Brandi. And Lee.
Hi, I'm Lee Laughlin, and I've been driving since 1997. I got my license in the state of Massachusetts at the time. It was 2070 best correction for a daytime only license. And I had my license about 4 or 5 months and asked my doctor what I would need to get a nighttime license. And she was shocked at how many miles I had already driven. And she said, well, you just need to practice at night and then take the test. And I did that. And so I had a full license in Massachusetts. And then we moved to New Hampshire, which has different laws. So I needed a bioptic. I was a bioptic user in high school and college. So I was familiar with the technique of using a bioptic, just not behind the wheel. But it was good to have the driving experience behind me before I started using a bioptic in my case. Now, both of my kids, I married a man with albinism, and both of my kids have albinism, and I taught both of them to drive, but they learned to use a bioptic first in the car and then learned to drive with it. So.
Great. Thank you, Lee. My next question kind of touches on some things you already talked about for all of you, but for the PWA, the next question is, how long have you been driving and are you a bioptic driver? And Lee, I think you did just answer those for us, but you are a bioptic driver, correct?
I am.
Yes,
This is my daytime bioptic.
Awesome.
And I'm sitting here
Everyone
cleaning
can
them.
see, yeah.
And then I also, this is my daytime, sorry, so the other one was my daytime. This is my daytime bioptic, so the carrier lenses are tinted.
Awesome. And then Matt, what about you?
So I don't have all of my bioptics because I have some of them that are actually in my car and I'm too lazy and sick to go get them. But I do have one of the bioptics I use during the day, and this is an unusual one in that it's called a Beta, and it's relatively small. And so it has a narrow field of view. So this is a little bit different than some of the other ones you see. But then I also have two of the ones that are designed for vision, which you're more typically going to see, that I use, one of them which I use at night, and one of which this one is designed so I'm actually wearing contacts to correct my vision, and then the bioptic is the magnification part. I also have another bioptic that has my correction in my lenses for when I don't want to wear my contacts but want to drive, that sometimes I'll use if I'm driving like after 7 or 8 at night and I'm like, I don't want to wear contacts. So, but yeah, that's they come in a lot of different sizes. I wish I had my wife's bioptic on me because she has the Architect version, which if you've seen it has a little bar above the glasses. So yeah, there's a wide variety of bioptics out there at this point.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And then Brandi, how long have you been driving and are you a bioptic driver?
Yes, I'll show my bioptics. I just have one pair, and these are it. Voila.
That's the Architect, is it not?
Yeah.
Excellent choice.
So I'll just give you a little more background into my driving story because it's been a wild ride. So I started I actually went to a driving school first. I went to a driving school and they were like, they didn't know what to do with me. They just taught me like how to drive. They didn't know what to do with the bioptic situation. And I was the first person that had ever encountered with the bioptics, but they were like, oh, okay, cool. Like we'll take it. We'll work with you. So I actually started driving with the school and got my bioptics, but I didn't really practice them the way that I should. But I had enough knowledge to be able to get my license. So I've had my license for quite a while, but I have not been consistently driving. So I got my license and I was like living in cities where I didn't necessarily need a car. I was living between DC and Chicago. So I didn't need, I was just like, well, okay, I accomplished it. This is what I wanted to do. This is something I set out to do. I'm good. And then my circumstances changed and I just wanted to learn how to drive. So I continued to take more classes, like more driving lessons. There wasn't really anybody that could really help me. So I just paid for like more lessons. And eventually I started working with the
Hey, Margo.
the Department of Rehabilitation Services. I believe every state has some version of that department. But and they bought my bioptics because to my knowledge, they're not covered under insurance typically. And so they bought my bioptic both times. So I would encourage those of you who are prospective drivers to look into working with them. And then the state also this time I
Wait.
wanted to get rehabilitation.
She's a Black woman with albinism and she drives the bioptic.
Oh, hello. So I for the second time that I was working with the Department of Rehabilitation Services, they paid for me to get driver rehabilitation services through Strive for Independence, which is in Illinois. So I worked with them, and that's where I really learned to use the bioptic. So I kind of had a little backwards of a story where I learned to drive first, and then I used the bioptic. And that's where I am now today.
Thank you, Brandi. If everyone could just mute themselves while our speakers are talking, that would be great if you're not already, or I will just go in after you, but thank you, Brandi. And for Chuck, from a clinician's perspective, who makes a good candidate for bioptic driving?
Excellent question. Okay. From a clinician standpoint, and we're talking now from either an ophthalmological or an optometric standpoint, normally those individuals that present stable ocular conditions, these either can be congenital, meaning present at or shortly after birth, or ones that are what we call long-term in nature. The reason why we go with this is such individuals are better adjusted to operating with lower levels of what we call visual acuity. And their brain as well is adjusted to interpreting less distinct images versus a person who suddenly loses acuity. They have what we call now a 2200 visual system, but they're operating with a 20/20 brain. Secondly, we're talking about individuals whose best corrected distance visual acuity falls below 2070 through 2200 inclusive. Now, you may say, Chuck, that's legal blindness. Well, that's correct. But do you realize that now we have over 20 states that actually allow people with best corrected distance visual acuity all the way down to 2200? And in 3 states, actually less than that, to demonstrate their proficiency to drive. Another good characteristic is full bilateral fields of view. And by that, we're talking about with no presence of any large scotomas other than your natural blind spot. If you happen to be monocular or only have vision out of one eye, doesn't mean you can't apply for driving. It just means that the field of view out of that eye should be at least 120 degrees horizontally or left and right, and about 80 degrees vertically up and down. Likewise, you have to show improved acuity when looking through a telescope, usually between 2 and 4x, though some states allow as much as 6x magnification now to meet your state's visual acuity needs. Other characteristics to consider would be good glare recovery skills. Remember that you have 3 different types of glare. You have what's called reflective glare. That's that which shines up and off the roadway, especially wet roadways, or the bumpers or the windows of cars. And then you have refractive glare, which if you have anything that's not appropriate on your cornea, on the lens of your eye, or in the vitreous in the back of your eye, in front of the retina, anything that can refract light that's going to cause a problem. Or what's called veiling glare, V-E-I-L-I-N-G. And veiling glare is something that affects all people, and that's where It's the type of glare you get with early morning rise of sun or the late sunset, okay? Or like with headlights at night, especially some of the newer type of headlights that provide a lot of glare. We would prefer to have someone who has good contrast sensitivity. And by that, we're talking about simply being able to detect an object or form from its background. Someone with good color vision, normal head and neck and eye movement, normal bilateral hearing, and average to above average intelligence, free of attention deficits. All of these things are appropriate. Someone who's highly motivated, someone who can accept criticism from an instructor or an examiner. These are all things that you have to take into consideration. Someone who's emotionally stable, someone who may have had past participation in sports that required good eye lead or head and eye scanning skills, as well as being a participant and being able to successfully complete a formalized program of instruction. Okay, next question.
Great, thank you, Chuck. Next question for PWA panelists. Lee, we'll start with you. What did the actual process of learning how to drive really look like for you?
So I was in my mid-20s and really wasn't expecting to drive. It was actually the one thing that they told me to do that I wouldn't do as a kid that I believed, unlike Matt. And I saw my low vision specialist in Boston. She had just prescribed a new set of contact lenses for me. It was new to the market. They're now, of course, ancient. And when I did the test for that and I hit 20/70, and just offhandedly, she said, "Oh, you qualify for a Massachusetts license." And I promptly burst into tears. Poor woman didn't know what to do with me. She insisted that I take driving lessons with somebody who was used to teaching people with bioptic lenses. And that was expensive, but it was well worth it. The other thing I did was I drove with a friend of mine. She happened to be older than I was, probably by about 10 or 15 years, but she was very generous with her time. And I learned to drive in Boston, which for those of you who aren't familiar, the roads are just god awful. They're paved cow paths. Sometimes they literally circle in on each other, and the traffic is just nuts. They're crazy. But so my low vision driving instructor taught me how to drive to pass the test and sort of the basics of what a driver was. My friend taught me how to survive on the roads and be an attentive and assertive, and I don't mean aggressive, but a driver that can, stay on the Boston roads and not get run off. And that was very helpful to have both perspectives. One thing that my driving instructor said to me early on was, it takes 6 years to learn how to become a really good driver. And I was 26 at that point, and I'm like, no. Yeah, it turns out he's right. It took that long to sort of encounter all the different aspects of driving, like driving through construction zones and snow and rain and sleet and hail and all the other fun things. I actually had the experience that they talk about where a ball rolls out in the street and you need to be able to find the child that's running after the ball. I actually had that experience. And it was, nobody got hurt. I had plenty of time. I stopped and waited. And of course the parent was beside themselves because the child just ran out into the street. But so that was the process for me.
Wow, very nice. And Brandi, what about you?
What's the question? It's like, what's the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know you kind of touched on this a little in the last one, but just any more insight into what the actual process of learning how to drive looked like, the training and everything?
Yeah, like I said before, I had lessons, but I think definitely just like regular driving lessons, but I think learning how to use the bioptics and drive was better, even though I did it a little later on. I think it was just more useful, like the tips and things that I learned. And just being able to have somebody that really knows about the low vision piece. I mean, there were for a while there, like I was missing a lot in terms of looking for, this sounds bad, but like looking for pedestrians. Like sometimes they would just like come out of nowhere, and like I had to really focus, and like it really helped to have somebody to really be able to zero in on like, this is the low vision aspect. Like I know you're not working with like, full vision, but like these are some tips and tricks. So I really enjoyed that aspect. And then just, I don't know, like learning to, it's already a stressful process, like driving. And then I'm in Chicago, which is not the nicest drivers. And so really, it's just like so many moving pieces, like so to speak, in terms of our vision, making sure like focusing on the road, focusing on what's going on. Like it's just so many moving pieces.
Wow, you're both in pretty major, you and Lee are both in pretty major cities driving, so that's very impressive. And then Matt, any more insight into your experience learning?
Yeah, so I had gotten a bioptic for like in high school that I kind of used mainly for like the chalkboard stuff, but it wasn't a really well made bioptic. Fortunately, they like don't make that particular model anymore. But I kind of put it aside, and then the bioptic I really wanted was the one I showed y'all earlier, this Bida. And somehow I ended up getting one while I was in college. And I remember putting it on. They shipped it to me at college in Chicago. And I remember putting it on and being like, I just wore it around for a week because I was so amazed at how well this worked. And, I wasn't even driving at that point. It was just like, to read menu boards at restaurants and stuff. This is back before we all had our iPhones we could do that with. And I was just like, I remember saying to my parents on the phone, like, I think I have an idea at least of what normally sighted people, their life is like. Like it didn't fix everything, but at least could like imagine what that would be like. It was so revolutionary. Well, in the meantime, Georgia had updated their laws so that, and kind of formalized them so I could drive. And so what they required was that you do a 30/6 program, which basically is what teenagers would have done then and would do now. But for, people over 18, normally you could just walk in, and if you could drive around the parking lot, you get a license. But for bioptic drivers, they required that you do 30 hours of classroom training and then 6 hours with a driving instructor. But they weren't particularly formalized on how they did it. Whereas if you went to Chuck's program in West Virginia, you would have had a very extensive program of people trained to work with bioptic drivers. Georgia wasn't quite that together with it, but I was very fortunate in that the instructor that I did have had worked with some bioptic drivers in the past, and he did a couple of really good things. One is that he actually sent me to do homework where he had me sit in the passenger seat with my parents and just look and sort of narrate what was going on and like tell them when I saw anything that might be relevant to a driver situation. I think Chuck actually, I learned years later, I think that's actually a formal part of what his program does. And it's just like narrating what was going on to give my parents an idea of what I was seeing and help me develop the skills of seeing. And I ultimately got my license. And he had me do a few other things, but it really was kind of this idea of taking the use of the bioptic, the operation of the motor vehicle, and then putting them together. After I got my license, kind of like Lee's story, I felt, I passed the test with flying colors, but I didn't really feel safe driving in a lot of places yet. I just didn't feel like I had enough experience. And so when I got my first job where I needed to drive to work, I had my dad help me the weekend before I learned how to drive from my apartment to work, into the supermarket and home. So like I could, get to work and stay fed. And a little bit later, we trained on like, okay, well, let's see what it'd be like to drive to like the Walmart, which is out on the main highway, and then, do that. A little bit later, I learned, a couple months later, after I felt more comfortable with that, okay, well, let's learn how to drive on the freeway to get from where you're living on one side of Atlanta to our house on the other side of Metro Atlanta. And so I got more comfortable doing that. But at first I only did that on, because I was driving on a really big ring freeway around Atlanta known as 285, which is known for traffic. So I would only do it on like weekends or Sunday mornings and stuff. But as time went on, it was really interesting to hear Lee's point that it takes 6 years to really learn how to drive, because I feel like that time frame is accurate. I mean, when I look back on how I was 6 years later, I was driving on the really, busy streets of Atlanta, which isn't quite as bad as Boston, but, it's up there. I was driving on the freeways in Atlanta, which are pretty bad. And and then shortly thereafter, I was driving long distance between Georgia and North Carolina a lot when my now wife and I started dating. So that was kind of my experience. And I think the main thing that I would stress is it's really helpful if you're in a situation where you have someone who's used to working with people with bioptics. That's really a key there, because you're not going to have someone who kind of like in Brandi's situation is like, well, we don't know what to do with you, but we'll do our best. It really is advantageous to have someone who knows how to help you incorporate the use of the bioptic into the driving process, because they're kind of separate things that you have to master and then integrate them together.
Very true. Chuck, are you still there?
Can I
Yes,
add one more
yes.
thing?
Oh, sure, Brandi.
I'm sorry, Chuck. I'm sorry. I just wanted to also add that another aspect that I also included in my driving experience was simulated driving through the Chicago Lighthouse for the blind and visually impaired. Now, I don't know if that's it may or may not work for people, but it was like another opportunity to like kind of work on driving and especially like reaction time. And I did wear the bioptic. So I just wanted to mention that might be another option. Like it's not of course behind the wheel per se, but it all works together to kind of get you it could get you like ready to get to that point.
Great. No, thank you for adding that, Brandi. Chuck, the reason I asked if you were still there, I thought I saw you come back in the waiting room, so I wanted to make sure we didn't lose connection.
No, I was trying to get back in, but
Okay.
I should point out at the beginning of your session, I was able to see and hear all of you just fine.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. We just couldn't see you.
It's just that you're unable to pick up me.
Yeah.
If I may add something to both Matt and Lee's conversation, when we were developing our program years ago, back in the mid-1980s, a representative who helped us put together a standardized on-road assessment, his name was Fred Van Osdale. He was a traffic safety specialist from Michigan State University. And we asked him, how long, Fred, do you think that we should require our drivers to drive before they come back and apply for nighttime privileges? They were only restricted, like Matt mentioned early, daytime privileges only. But what he said, in our case, he said, even with your training, Chuck, and ours is 90 hours in length, he said, it's going to be a good 3 years before they're going to feel comfortable in driving in all types of driving environments, roadways, road conditions, etc. And at that point, if they have a good record and the doctor agrees and they have an up-to-date vision exam and it meets the qualifications, then have them come back and apply for nighttime privileges. Just wanted to add that.
I will say if I put a little bit of a counterpoint to that, Chuck, I will say that I think albinism is a little bit of an interesting vision impairment in that a lot of it, like the two most common sort of what I would say are arbitrary restrictions for people with vision challenges are, well, you can't drive on the freeway or you can't drive at night. I don't have either of those restrictions, but right away, my driving instructor noticed that the two situations where I felt most comfortable and at ease were driving on the freeway and driving at night. So it's unfortunate but to your greater point, I do think that it's good to sort of tackle and conquer those situations because, when you're in a situation like Brandi, where you're in Chicago and there are a lot of pedestrians, that's a very different situation than if you're driving in rural Nebraska and you're more looking out for, is there going to be a tractor going slowly in the road, for example, going to market,
Yeah. And I should point out that some states start out conservatively, meaning they'll only allow daytime privileges. And sometimes, for instance, Pennsylvania, that just passed an excellent 2200 bill, but they don't require at this point any type of interstate driving. The state of Oregon, years ago, they first started off in 2004 with only daytime privileges without the interstate. And it took them about 3 or 4 years, and the good driving records of those that were licensed gave proof to the fact that you should allow them with appropriate training and experience consider interstate driving. So I agree with you, Matt. Okay.
Oh, I know you agreed with me.
But, each state's a little bit different. Remember, driving for normally sighted as well as anyone who is physically challenged is a state regulated function. So no two states are going to approach things exactly the same. And keep that in mind.
Definitely. And on that note, Chuck, I did have another question for you. What type of testing procedures can a bioptic driver applicant expect to participate in when they venture to a typical DMV driving testing center for driver's licensing purposes?
Excellent question. Okay. In the event that there is no formalized sequence of services or services available for someone who is visually challenged, you can expect the following. Everybody, including those that are normally sighted, when you apply for your first license, as everybody knows, you've got to undergo a vision screening. Most states now only require that to be an acuity reading, and you have to get down somewhere 20/40 or better in the better functioning eye. In our state, you're allowed to use both eyes together, meaning you don't have to shut off one eye and then test left and right separately. It's both eyes together. If you're unable to get to 20/40, then they're going to tell you got to go back to an eye doctor. They give you the form, have them fill it out. If you can, with best standard correction, get to 20/40, then you'll be permitted to go on to taking your road test, or not your road test, but your permit test for knowledge of road laws and road signs. And then you go from there to your road test. If you're visually challenged, and let's say there is a program of services available, one of the first things you'll find out is, and this is what I tell all parents, so if there's parents out there in the audience or low vision consumers, whether you're a male or a female, the first thing you want to do, if you're 15 years of age or older, is make contacts with your state's vocational rehabilitation facilities. And the reason is, oftentimes, not only is the screening, but all of the training services are covered in full or part. So these services, as far as going to an eye doctor, instead of spending anywhere from $200 to $400 out of your mom and dad's pocket, they may pay for that screening service. So depending upon if you know what the vision requirements are in your particular state, you go fill out a certain type of eye exam, and each state has an eye exam from DMV, and then you bring it back to DMV. Sometimes you have to be screened from a standpoint of an active passenger in car from the front right seat, as well as behind the wheel. And we do that in our state. So in addition to a vision screening, you have to come to a rehab center and have what we call a functional vision and an actual in-car, on-road screening. If you pass that, you send in all of that information along with a release. Anytime more than one agency is involved, one agency has to put together a release of information. What are we going to share with DMV about you, okay, with your approval? And if you're below 18 years of age, you may have to have it signed by a parent or your assigned field counselor. If you qualify visually, then when you're ready for training and you've had your bioptic purchase, you have to apply for an instructional permit. Some states have restrictions on your permit, meaning you can only drive with an instructor, you can only drive with an examiner. Other states, you're allowed to drive outside of class with your parent or someone else that's 21 years of age or older. So it's a vision exam, you're going to have a functional screen, then you take your permit test, which is now on a computer. And if you're unable to read the small print, you can get a reader at the DMV, but you have to advise them in advance. Then you come back for training. We also use, so that no one can try to slip through the system, after your screen, we require that you have a certificate of eligibility. And all of those things have to be in the master computer at the DMV office before you start training. Upon the completion of training, you have to have a certificate of completion along with an updated eye exam. And along with the reports from any passenger in car work, classroom work, behind the wheel work, etc. Some states, not all, and in fact, it's only about 20 to 25% of states right now require at this point in time for visually impaired bioptic applicants to take a special road test. Most states are going to the thing where if you can complete the 60 to 90 to 120 hours, whatever it may be, of training, they feel that you've had enough experience that a common road test, just like a normally sighted person, is sufficient for licensure as far as daytime privileges to begin with. Most states nowadays will require, after your license, that you have an annual visual exam. And after 1 year, if you have no at-fault accidents, no suspensions, no moving violations, then you can apply for nighttime privileges. Some states, it's a little bit longer. In West Virginia, we still require 3 years, 36 months of no moving violations, no at-fault accidents, no suspensions of your license, okay, before you can come back and apply for nighttime training and testing. So each state's a little bit different, but expect whether there's formalized training or not training, you're going to have a vision exam or a vision screening, you're going to have a knowledge test, and then you're going to have a road test. Okay? Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Chuck. I have a
You're
couple
welcome.
more questions and then we will open it up to everybody. For PWA, we'll start with Brandi. What has been your biggest challenge with driving and how do you think you have overcome it?
I think there's been a couple. Definitely the anxiety. I used to be really, really anxious when driving because just the magnitude of the responsibility of driving for myself and to, be in that position and also to think about other people on the road or pedestrians and things like that. So I used to just be really anxious about it. But I think just continuing, one thing that helped me was continuing to practice is actually to do it and to have supportive people be in the car with me, whether it was like my friend who was letting me drive her, like around the corner or something. Or just the driver teachers that instructors that I encounter. So I think that just helped, like a combination of actually doing it and just getting more confidence with it. I think that has been a really big issue for me. It's just feeling more confident, like trusting my judgment, trusting, just the process. So anxiety was a big thing for me. And I think being in Chicago and being like, it's a lot of aggressive drivers. I think just focusing on what is happening with me in the car, like, cause it could go, like, it could be just so much going on and, just not paying attention, like, of course, paying attention, but not letting certain things that people are doing, like, affect me, like just focusing on what I'm doing and making sure that I have all that I need and that I'm prepared. And I think just also making sure that I have all the tools that I need. Like I wear a visor typically because of the sun and things like that. Just relying on different tools that make me feel comfortable when I'm driving. So those are some things that I've encountered and have kind of worked through and continue to work through in my driving journey.
Great. Thank you, Brandi. Matt, what challenges have you come across?
I can definitely relate to Brandi's part about the anxiety, particularly in the first decade, but even today in weird situations. And the terrible injustice of anxiety is that at some level being anxious makes you worse at whatever you're trying to do, but it's a natural feeling when you're in a scary situation. I think the other sort of obstacles, some of them were being really practical of just, one of the things that, Chuck had mentioned, sort of the valence glare issue, but, we all know that with albinism, there's the sensitivity to bright light, which fortunately can be mitigated in a wide variety of ways, a lot better than the visual acuity part of it can. But I found things like I am obsessive about cleaning my windshield because I can't afford to have whereas other people can just be like, oh yeah, it's filthy, it doesn't matter. No, I need to be able to not have the sun hit my windshield and then all of a sudden it's just like wax paper. No, I am obsessively cleaning my windows and stuff like that. So some of it is just anticipating ahead of time. Back in the old days when we didn't have GPS, I was like the king of MapQuest, and I would MapQuest every. And this is ancient history now, thank goodness. But I would MapQuest everything and figure out where I needed to go. I would get back when they had it on the computer, but you didn't have it on your phone. I would get pictures of where I was going, or if I were just having a friend tell me where to go, I would have them give me a good description of it. And they're like, "Oh, you can't miss it," and I'd be like, "Oh no, I can't." Because I've often joked to people I could drive 10,000 miles, but I'll get lost 100 feet from where I'm supposed to be because I won't recognize where I'm going. So some of those little just developing little tricks to, knowing where you're going. And even now with GPS, I think I'll often usually kind of look at the route just because I don't want to be in a situation where the GPS is telling me to do something crazy and I'm just blindly following it, even though it's gotten a lot better. I think one of the bigger obstacles too, though, is just kind of, I don't want to get too much of my high horse about this, but I feel like there's definitely some preconceived things that people have about vision, and we definitely all hear them, and it's easy to internalize them. And it's kind of like, well, how can you drive? How can you drive? You have to hold things this close to read the magazine or newspaper. I'm like, well, I don't read the magazine while I drive. But I do feel like there is a lot, statistically speaking, there are a lot of things that make you a worse driver, just in terms of correlations, than low vision acuity. As far as albinism goes, if you go back to that list of things that Chuck talked about, with, who makes a good candidate, albinism is really one of the better visual impairments you can have in general. Now, everybody's case is different, of course, but it's a lot, we generally have good peripheral vision. We generally don't have some of those, glare issues caused by problems with our lenses of our eyes and stuff like that. We're generally pretty, we can generally see pretty well at night. But people hear low visual acuity and they just assume, you can't see anything. And I think that's nothing new to those of us with low vision, is that people don't really understand what that means and everyone is different. But I really do think there's a lot of sort of preconceived notions about, well, how can you drive? What is that thing on your telescope? And I think part of the way I've overcome that is just, you have to learn to be your own advocate. You have to learn to be your own educator. And that a lot of times people aren't, it's just, they don't know. Cause why would you, if if it's not impacting you, you don't know. So I guess that's how I've sort of overcome that, is just feeling more empowered to sort of like, well, let me explain how this works to you, or let me explain why this isn't, as bad as you think. Or
very nice. Lee, I saw you giving thumbs up during some of that. Any other thoughts for you? Anything that gave you anxiety or fears?
There we go. Yeah, like Matt, I am very, very obsessive about my windshield. Actually, for all three of us, my daughter. So I want to say a couple things. I did say that I taught both of my kids to drive. My daughter still has her license, but lives in Boston and has opted not to drive. She would prefer to take public transportation. She kept her license. She can still drive in an emergency, but just really isn't interested in driving. She finds it very stressful. My son is very much like me. We live in New Hampshire. We live on a dirt road, so we're a mile of pavement in all directions. And we have to teach kids to look out for things like deer and chickens and turkeys. And that's a whole other kind of a common, pedestrians at least know to stop and maybe step back. The turkeys, they don't care. They just keep right on going. But as far as things that made me anxious, I had to get over my perfectionism of always wanting to make the correct turn and just let it go. It's like, oh, I missed that turn. We'll circle in on it. And GPS certainly has made a huge difference. I will never buy another car that doesn't have a screen that lets me plug my phone in. If I can't have Apple CarPlay, I'm not interested in that vehicle. And the lighting, it's just something that takes time, especially oncoming headlights. because your tendency is to turn away. And obviously you can't do that while you're driving, but if you can find that sweet spot where you're still looking at the road, but you're not staring head on into that headlight, it's almost like just depending on the lighting conditions around you, it's slightly off the center. So it might be down or up. So those are the things that I have learned. But with 3 drivers in the house, I went out, I found these like cloths. I can't remember who makes them. Someone's going to ask me and I can't remember who it is. It's one of those, I don't want to say pyramid, but it's an MLM company where you have to buy it through a consultant, and they're amazing on windows. They're just really great. There's one in all of the cars. So you can, without water, you can still clean your window. I mean, water's better, but if you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think too, that the new technology has made it better. I think it's crucial. And I taught my kids to drive without a backup camera, but the new technologies that are out there really make it incredibly helpful.
Awesome. And Chuck, from your perspective, the same question, but a little different. What are some of the more common driving challenges that you've seen illustrated by low vision drivers?
Okay. Now, before I mention that my list of things, I want you to be aware there are now 48 of 50 states in the U.S. that now allow or approve bioptics for driving. What we found in our pilot study that began in '85, and what we found with our full-time program that started in 2009, the following were some of the common things that if the individual never expected to drive or never thought to pay attention because they knew they didn't qualify visually, the following are some of the things that we have to correct the first couple weeks of driving if it's going to become realistic. The first is what we call eye lead, and that's knowing where to look so many seconds down the roadway. If you have low eye lead, that's one of the reasons why young novice drivers are unable to stay in lane. In other words, between the mustard and the mayo on a two-way street. Likewise, you like that, Matt? Okay. Likewise, head and eye scanning. Novice drivers in particular oftentimes stare at oncoming cars or stare at the center yellow line or stare at the white edge line. If you do so, that will also cause weaving in lane. With low eye lead time, if you're not at an acceptable, what we call following distance from the car ahead, we strongly recommend, irregardless of the type of setting you're driving in, that you stay a good 3 to 4 seconds. That's 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004. That's not 4 car lengths. That's 4 seconds between you and the vehicle that's immediately in lane in front of you. Young novice drivers oftentimes, because they don't pay attention to mom or dad or older brother or older sister in the car, they don't know what to do when they come up to an intersection. In other words, who yields to you, who at a cross-shaped intersection? And we introduce yielding procedures. For instance, if you arrive there at the same time a car on the right, you always yield to the car on the right. If you arrive at the same time as an oncoming car and you're turning left, you always yield to the car that's going straight through the intersection, okay? Things like what we call hazard perception skills. For instance, a lot of drivers who never expected to drive, and by the way, this can happen even with normally sighted kids if they never expected to drive, or they're young and their dad and mom says, you're 15 years of age, now you can get your permit. But if they haven't paid attention, these next things will arise. For instance, you're in a typical driving environment. You're approaching an intersection, but the crossroad is hidden by buildings on the right or a big tree on the left. And they don't realize that they could be hiding things on the other side of them. For instance, a young child chasing a ball that comes out into the street, or a car that's already stopped at the intersection and you don't see the stop sign and you don't see the car pull out until the last minute. So hidden objects or forms, situations where another driver is distracted. A lot of times they'll pull across without checking their blind spot. Or can you identify when you have let's say an aging driver who's confused and turns the wrong way on a one-way street? Or you get a very aggressive driver who executes a driving maneuver unsafely. These are the sort of things that are taught in a formalized program of instruction. But one of the big things, and if there's any parents out there on this call, this is what I want you to remember. The fact that 48 of 50 states now allow us to bring individuals in, screen them, train them, test them, etc. You've got to allow your sons and daughters to begin making independent decisions, okay, that are going to be appropriate for driving. Do not overprotect Sally or Johnny, okay? Now, the fact that you have reduced acuity is also going to mean that there is still, irregardless of how many collision avoidance systems we have, GPS systems we have, there's still, at this point, a need for correction for your distant detail awareness and identification. And if you have a reduction in that, that's where proper and safe use of the telescope is going to still be needed. Okay?
Can
All right.
I,
Thank you, Chuck.
Casey, I just want to tag one thing on.
Yes.
Chuck, I understand your point about the 1,000, 2, 1,000, and I think Matt and Brandi will both agree with me here. In the real world, that is not, if you leave that space, you're going to get cut off. And I mean, I flat out in Boston, it's going to happen. In New Hampshire, it's a little different. In New Hampshire, they're a little bit more laid back. Vermont, even more so. You know, as you move out into the more rural spaces, they won't cut you off quite as badly. But if you are a city driver, you have to be aware of what's going on around you. And you have to make every effort to leave that space. You really do. It is crucial, but you also have to anticipate that somebody's going to cut you off.
My driving instructor, in fact, he said this in front of the whole class in classroom training. He read the official line from the book about, that is the proper distance. And he looked up and said, I'm just going to tell you, if you're on 285, you're going to have to alter it to this, because if you do, someone will pull out in front of you. And 285 is for those not familiar with Atlanta, is a very busy ring freeway. Now, he acknowledged, in theory, this is correct, but I think that's where cases where knowing your local circumstances, and again, this is where it gets very complicated, because, it's very different to drive in a place like, I learned to drive in Atlanta, and Boston scares me. But I've driven in Chicago, and it's scary. But, I've also heard people who I think a lot of people here in North Carolina didn't grow up with freeways, because a lot of our interstates here were built long after Eisenhower first proposed them. And they don't know how to drive on the interstates here in a lot of cases. And I'll be very polite to try to let people change lanes, and they won't take it unless they get a country mile. And so I do think that you have to kind of adapt yourself to local mores. And then when you get a place where a lot of people have moved from another area, and you've got people who will still think they're in New York, and people who still think they're in rural, whatever state that they're in, and they're all mixing together in a community, man, this is where you just, I think this is where to your point, Chuck, I think this is where you have to anticipate the unanticipated.
Well, I understand where you're coming at, but trust me, Matt, when your son or daughter gets older, do not teach them to follow at a 2-second following distance.
Oh, I'm not. Rest assured, no. I'm not.
Okay. Now, let me give you an example why we emphasize that. Okay. And I'm going to tell you right now, having been cross-trained and been in the field for over 40 years, I'm a strong proponent of adequate following distance, irregardless of how aggressive the type of driving environment or how busy the environment is. When you follow a large vehicle, a wide, tall vehicle, how far back do you think you should be so that the driver of that vehicle can see you? Would you still follow at 2 seconds?
Absolutely not.
No, and you
No,
also, that's one thing
not
that
a
kids don't
semi.
learn today is about how to
Yeah.
navigate around truckers,
Yeah.
for example, and what they
Yeah.
can and cannot see, but that's a whole nother,
Mhm.
we'll be on
Yeah.
this call for an hour
The
if we get
reason-
into that subject.
Well, it's a good point, and I really want to bring this up. The reason you can't, if that individual cannot see you with either one of his side mirrors, okay, if he suddenly stops, I can guarantee you're going to be kissing the back end of that truck. That's one of the reasons 18-wheelers had that extended lower bumper bar, okay, to prevent decapitations. And that's one of the first things we learned as a trained evaluator in car by Michigan State is adequate following distance. Whether you're going 70 miles an hour, 35 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour.
Well, if
I
you rear
know
end someone,
that-
it's automatically your fault too. So
Yeah. Well, I know it. But we're not saying that you shouldn't be driving speed limit. We're just saying you have to have, and then even if you get cut off, someone cuts in, then you have to readjust your following distance. We teach that. And you have to teach students to be able to do that. Okay? So you're not going to win this battle. Okay? I don't think a driver educator anywhere, okay, is going to agree with you that you should have anything. It used to be taught 2 seconds, a following distance of 2 seconds was acceptable. What they were saying is under ideal conditions. Keep in mind that people are now more distracted because of telephones, okay, things happening in the vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. I can share with you just what happened on the West Virginia Turnpike within the past 48 hours. We had a multiple rear-end collision. 3 people who were stopped paying their toll on the West Virginia Turnpike had their car hit from the rear, and all 3 were killed by fire. Okay? So please, if there's anything I can share with you tonight, please reconsider what you said about following distance, okay?
again,
Don't
to
let the-
reiterate, I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I agree with physics. I merely suggest you might want to talk to the people in Massachusetts on 128 because they have different worldviews on this. That's
Yeah,
all.
and I'm
And-
not
and-
saying that you shouldn't. I'm not saying you have to follow closely. I'm saying you have to be prepared to cut off, and then readjust.
Oh, yes. Yes.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I
Yes,
think
it-
the young driver hears that, well, at least up here. The young driver hears that there should be that much distance. And I also think for the parents on the call, and Chuck, you say this, you talk about the tractor trailers, and by you, I mean the larger you. You talk about the tractor trailers being able to see you in their rear view mirrors. Well, guess what? I can't see if they can see me in their rear view mirrors. So it's incumbent upon me because you should be able to see yourself in their rear view mirror is what they're saying. It is incumbent upon me to back way off especially on a tractor trailer. But that's an experience thing.
But what you can do when you follow a tractor and trailer, even if you can't see the silhouette of the person in the mirror, if you can't see both mirrors simultaneously as the person in the vehicle behind the truck, then you're following too close.
Yeah,
okay?
I agree.
That's all you need. That's all you need. Okay. You don't have to see the driver. Okay. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to, elaborate on what I'm sharing with you, but please, this is something that is preventable. This is a defensive driving skill that we emphasize the first 2 or 3 hours out in the car. We don't even go over the use of the telescope until the beginning of the second week, okay, unless they have good eye lead, good eye scanning, and good and consistent following distance, okay? Irregardless if they've had 40 hours of driving with mom or dad, okay? And sometimes that's the young person that you have to be concerned about, okay? You can't let your guard down. And oftentimes people will lane change without checking their blind spot. Okay. They'll lane jump. Okay. You've heard of lane jumpers where they lane change more than one lane at the same time. Catastrophic accidents. Okay. So these are things, if you leave adequate following distance, you can compensate for the errors of others.
One thing I think I would add to this, Chuck, is that I think one of the advantages, if you will, of having a well crafted training program for bioptic drivers is that a lot of times it also, in the process of teaching you how to use the bioptic to drive and how to drive with low vision, it also makes you just a better driver in general, because it is covering a lot of these detail points where I really kind of suspect that are getting grazed over in the stereotypical high school program that normally sighted kids are going through in their high schools or afterwards.
100%. Yeah, and that's why we go to the nth degree, Matt, to make it a little bit longer. We feel that after 6 weeks of instruction, up to 30 hours behind the wheel, 30 hours passenger in car, and 30 hours of classroom. Everybody thinks that if you're 18 years of age, you don't need classroom. Guess what? After being in this area for 40 years with low vision drivers, age 15 through 90, over 90 years of age, there hasn't been one person that said, Chuck, I didn't think your classroom instruction was necessary. A lot of times older people never had driver education, and they enjoy it by the way it's pursued at this point. Okay, you watch DVDs, etc., and you stop and listen. You go over things, and then you reinforce it as a passenger in car and behind the wheel. It all makes sense and makes you safer drivers. Okay.
I know
Absolutely.
we're way over time here, so I want to kind of try
Yeah.
to wrap things up. Casey, I really appreciate the PWAs that joined the panel this evening. We have a great group here, and a lot of great information was shared. I hope that everyone that was joining us this evening had all the questions asked. If not, Chuck, I do appreciate if we could forward your email information out to the attendees this
By all
evening.
means. By all
Okay.
means. By all
Very
means.
good.
Yes, thank you so much, Matt, Brandi, Lee,
You're welcome.
Chuck. You all were great.
Thanks, everyone.
So much insight. And this is recorded, so we will be sending it out to everyone who attended if you want to watch it again. And we'll be sharing Chuck's info with anyone who needs it as well. So thanks so much for coming, everybody. Have a really
Thank
good
you,
night.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.